My name is Evelyn Marston. I'm 67 years old. By the time the last black car pulled away from the cemetery, I thought the worst of the day was over. The house was supposed to be my quiet refuge, a place where grief could unfold in private. Instead, when I stepped inside, I found my daughter standing in the front hall, one hand on her hip, a thick folder pressed against her chest. Lydia had always been composed, but that afternoon her composure had edges. "Mom," she began, voice smooth as glass, "we need to talk about Dad's estate." Her words landed like a stone in still water. The smell of lilies from the funeral arrangements clung to every corner of the house. I set my handbag on the entry table and waited for her to continue. "It's all been settled," she said briskly. "The accounts, the house, everything's under my name now. Dad wanted to simplify things." For a moment, I thought she was speaking through her grief, filling silence with nonsense. Henry was meticulous. Nothing about his life had ever been simplified. "That's not possible," I said quietly. "He would have discussed that with me." Lydia's smile tightened. "You're not in any position to manage property or finances, Mom. You'll be more comfortable somewhere smaller. There's a retirement community near Tybee Island. They have shuttle buses and everything." The words barely registered. I looked at her, the same brown eyes Henry used to call his own, and searched for the daughter I'd raised. But what looked back at me was calculation dressed as kindness. When I didn't answer, she exhaled sharply and dropped the mask. "You need to find somewhere else to die. You're useless now." The world tilted. I heard myself laugh once, soft and absurd, because it was easier than screaming. I packed 2 suitcases that evening. 43 years of marriage fit into less space than I'd imagined. Family photos, a few dresses, Henry's old briefcase. The rest I left behind. Lydia waited by the door, checking her phone, already miles away in her mind. Outside, the air was heavy with rain. I walked to the curb and called a cab, the porch light still burning behind me. The lilies inside would wilt by morning. When the driver asked for an address, I said the first one that came to mind, the Palmetto Inn off River Street. The room smelled of bleach and rain. The carpet was thin, the kind that left faint patterns on your skin if you sat on it too long, and the single lamp flickered as if uncertain it wanted to work. I set my suitcases by the bed and stood there for a while, not ready to sit, not ready to think. The silence after a funeral is a strange thing, it hums. Every sound feels too sharp, the drip from the sink, the hum of the air conditioner, the distant rumble of cars along River Street. I took off my coat and hung it over the chair, as if pretending this were a hotel room on vacation. It wasn't. I made tea using the old kettle provided, though the water tasted faintly of metal. Lydia's words kept echoing between the walls. "You're useless now. Find somewhere else to die." I said them aloud once just to see if they'd sound less cruel in my own voice. They didn't. Henry's briefcase sat on the dresser, still scratched from our last trip together. I'd packed it without thinking, a habit of 40 years. He never went anywhere without it. I unlatched the brass locks, and the smell of old paper and tobacco drifted out, steadying me in a way nothing else had all day. Inside were folders of tax returns, insurance forms, and a small black ledger, the one he used to jot notes in after long evenings in his study. He had always been careful, deliberate, the kind of man who double-checked receipts and made copies of everything. That was why Lydia's words hadn't settled right. "It's all under my name now." It didn't sound like Henry at all. I ran my fingers across the ledger's worn cover. Maybe it was foolish to look, but in that moment, it was the only thread of him I had left. The only proof that somewhere beneath grief and betrayal, truth was still waiting to be found. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving a thin mist over the river. I checked out of the Palmetto Inn just after 7, the briefcase tucked under my arm. I didn't know where else to go, so I walked toward Bay Street and found myself standing outside a brick building I knew too well, the office of Charles Denton, Henry's attorney for nearly 20 years. Charles had always struck me as a man who aged the same way Oak did, slowly, solidly, without bending. When his secretary saw me in the doorway, her face flickered with surprise. "Mrs. Marston," she said softly. "Mr. Denton will be right with you." He emerged a moment later, gray-haired and startled. "Evelyn, my goodness, I've been trying to reach you for weeks. Lydia told me you were in Florida for medical treatment." "Florida," I repeated, lowering myself into the chair opposite his desk. "I've been in Savannah. I buried my husband 3 days ago." Charles's brow furrowed deeply. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with a blue ribbon, the kind Henry insisted on using for important documents. "Then something's very wrong," he said. "Lydia came in the day after the funeral. She said you were unwell and that she'd handle everything on your behalf. I called your house several times. I stared at the envelope. She never told me." He slid the will across the desk. "The reading hasn't even been held. It should have been you sitting here, not her." My hands felt cold against the polished wood. Lydia had stood in that same spot and lied with the ease of someone who'd practiced. Charles looked at me carefully. "Evelyn, your husband was meticulous. He would never have left matters like this to chance. I think you should read this." The ribbon came undone easily, as if it had been waiting for me. I traced Henry's signature on the first page, strong, confident, unmistakable, and felt the air shift around me. Every instinct I had told me the same thing: Lydia hadn't just taken advantage of my grief. She'd built her power on it. The daughter I'd taught to tell the truth had used my silence as permission. Charles adjusted his glasses and smoothed the papers across his desk. The rain had started again outside, tapping against the window with a steady patience that matched his voice. "Your husband was thorough," he said quietly. "He revised his will less than a year ago." I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, afraid that moving might break the moment. He began to read. "Henry Marston left 70% of all Holdings real estate savings investments to me, the house on Whitaker Street, the accounts in Savannah First Bank, the retirement fund he'd built with decades of careful saving. My share totaled $27 million. My breath caught not at the number, but at the care behind it. For Henry, precision had always been an act of love. Then Charles's tone shifted slightly. "The remaining $12 million is placed in trust for your daughter, Lydia Carter. Distribution of these funds is conditional upon her treatment of her mother, Evelyn Marston, with respect, dignity, and compassion." He looked up from the page. "By forcing you out, she violated the clause entirely." The room fell silent, except for the rain. I thought of Lydia standing in our hallway, voice sharp and unshaken, as she told me to leave. Every word of that conversation now echoed differently, like evidence. "Henry predicted this," Charles murmured. "He didn't trust her judgment with money, but he trusted yours. He told me once that you'd always been the steady one." Something inside me shifted, then a quiet current moving beneath the grief. All this time I'd believed Henry had left without a word, but he'd spoken in the only language he knew, paper signatures, clauses meant to last beyond breath. I ran my thumb along his signature at the bottom of the page. The ink had faded slightly, but the lines were unmistakably his. He'd protected me even from our own daughter. Charles leaned forward. "Evelyn, you have every legal right to reclaim what's yours. We can move quickly." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of both betrayal and gratitude settle into the same space. "Then it's my turn," I said softly, to finish what he started. Outside, thunder rolled over the river, low and deliberate, as if the city itself was listening. By the next morning, Charles had already contacted the authorities. His efficiency reminded me of Henry, steady, methodical, unwilling to waste a second once the truth was clear. He spoke to the bank manager, filed the reports, and looped in a young investigator from the district attorney's office. The words fraud and elder abuse sounded heavy in the air, but also clean, like something finally being set right. We spent most of the day in his office going through papers. Each form required a signature, and each signature felt like a small act of reclamation. For weeks, my hand had trembled whenever I tried to write. but now the pen moved firmly across the page. My name belonged to me again. Charles's assistant, a quiet woman named Erin, brought me coffee and a folder of bank statements. "They've already placed a hold on the joint accounts," she said gently. "Your daughter won't be able to withdraw a cent until this is resolved." By noon, the first call came from the bank, confirming that all accounts under Lydia Carter's name were frozen pending investigation. By evening, Charles received another update. Her husband's business card had been declined at a private club downtown. I imagined the moment she realized it, standing at some glossy counter-confusion, turning to panic. The thought didn't bring satisfaction so much as stillness. After all the noise, the shouting, the humiliation, this was the first quiet that felt like peace. When the final document was signed, Charles leaned back and said, "We'll let the system work now." I nodded, gathering the papers into Henry's briefcase. The metal clasps clicked shut with a sharp final sound that echoed through the room. It was the sound of something shifting, something long overdue. The call came just after sunset. I was sitting by the kitchen window of the small rental I'd taken near Forsyth Park, the briefcase open on the table beside me. The air smelled faintly of jasmine, and for the first time in weeks, I'd started to believe quiet could exist without fear. Then the phone rang. Mom Lydia's voice was thin, the kind of voice people use when they're pretending to stay calm. "There's been a mistake. Everything's locked. The bank, the accounts, Kevin's cards were declined at dinner." I closed the ledger in front of me and let the silence stretch. "It's not a mistake," I said evenly. "I just spoke to your father's lawyer." There was a sharp inhale on the other end. "You wouldn't do that," she said quickly, her voice trembling now. "You wouldn't destroy your own daughter." I looked out at the streetlights flickering to life. "You did that when you told me to disappear." For a moment, all I could hear was her breathing short, uneven, desperate. It reminded me of when she was a child and used to lie about breaking something, hoping that silence could erase guilt. "Mom, please," she whispered. "You don't understand. I was just trying to protect what Dad built. I didn't want it wasted." "Protecting someone doesn't start with eviction notices," I said quietly. The sound that followed wasn't quite a sob. It was smaller, more hollow, like the first crack in something fragile. I didn't hang up, but I didn't speak again either. The distance between us did all the talking. When the line finally went dead, I set the phone down and exhaled. The jasmine outside still carried on the breeze, steady and sweet, untouched by all of it. The world, it seemed, had already moved on. 2 days later, Savannah woke under a silver sky, the kind that makes the air feel heavy before rain. I was standing at the corner of Whitaker and Gaston, the same street where Lydia lived with her husband. Police cars lined the curb, their lights flashing against the pale facades of the historic row houses. The scene looked almost peaceful, blue and red reflections rippling across the old brick like water disturbed by truth. I hadn't planned to come. Charles had called that morning to say the arrest warrants were signed, but something inside me needed to see it, to make sure this part of the story actually happened in daylight, not just in paperwork. A few neighbors gathered nearby, whispering behind their hands. I heard Lydia before I saw her. Her voice carried from the porch, shocked, indignant, trembling. "There has to be a mistake. My mother wouldn't do this." The officers moved quietly, their politeness almost tender as they guided her down the steps. She was still in her silk robe hair, unbrushed, trying to keep her chin high. Cameras from a local news crew clicked in bursts, catching every angle. Somewhere behind her, her husband Kevin was on the phone, pacing his own voice, cracking through the humid air. When Lydia's eyes found me across the street, she froze. For a brief moment, the arrogance disappeared, replaced by something I hadn't seen since she was a child. Fear, confusion, the realization that the ground beneath her wasn't solid anymore. I didn't move. There was nothing left to say. By the time the police car pulled away, The first drops of rain had started to fall. The crowd dispersed quickly, umbrellas blooming like dark flowers. I turned and walked the few blocks home through streets that smelled of wet magnolia and river wind. When I reached my house, I unlocked the front door, the same key Lydia once waved in front of me as if it already belonged to her. Inside, the air was cool and still. I placed my umbrella by the door and ran my hand along the banister Henry had polished every spring. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like itself again, quiet, steady, and at last mine. The rain had eased by morning, leaving the garden washed and bright. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and lemon oil. Charles had sent someone to air the place while I'd been gone. I moved slowly through each room, touching things as if reacquainting myself with an old friend. In the parlor, sunlight fell across the piano Henry used to play when the evenings were long and we still believed time was endless. I lifted the lid and pressed one key. It gave a thin, wavering note, out of tune but alive. When I sat down, the seat creaked and something shifted beneath it. I lifted the bench lid and found an envelope wedged under the sheet music, yellowed around the edges. My name was written across it in Henry's handwriting, slanted, careful, a little unsteady from the last year of his life. For a moment, I couldn't open it. My hands were steady, but my breath wasn't. Then I tore the seal and unfolded the paper. If she ever forgets who you are, this will remind you. You were always the foundation. That was all. No signature, no date. Just those few words written in the voice that had anchored my life for 4 decades. The tears came slowly, not from anger or grief, but from release. All the months of confusion, the loneliness, the disbelief, it all loosened like a knot finally giving way. Henry hadn't left me alone in the wreckage. He had known what might come and left behind what he could, his trust, his foresight, his faith in who I was. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back under the bench. The house seemed to breathe again, the silence warmer now, as if it too had been waiting for me to find it. 3 days passed before the knock came. The light was fading soft gold, sinking into the mossy trees outside the gate. I was in the kitchen folding linens when I heard it, hesitant, uneven, the sound of someone who wasn't sure if they had the right to be there. Through the front window, I saw Lydia standing at the gate. Her hair hung loose, her makeup streaked from tears and rain. The proud woman who once barked orders across marble floors now looked smaller, unsteady, as if the world had finally stopped bending for her. "Mom!" she called out, voice hoarse. "Please." I didn't mean it. I swear I didn't. Kevin's gone, the accounts are frozen. I have nothing. I stepped onto the porch but didn't go farther. The distance between us felt too fragile to cross. For a moment, all I could see was the little girl she'd once been, barefoot in the garden, clutching dandelions for me to keep in a vase. That memory hurt more than her cruelty ever had. "You told me to find somewhere else to die," I said quietly. And I did, but I also found somewhere to live. Her face crumpled. "Please, Mom, I can fix it. I just need time." I shook my head slowly. "I forgave you before you asked. But forgiveness doesn't reopen doors." Lydia reached for the gate, fingers trembling on the iron latch, but she didn't push it open. We both knew she wouldn't. Some distances aren't measured in feet, but in years and choices. As I turned to go inside, I heard her crying, soft and broken, the kind of sound that doesn't ask for pity, only witness. The porch light flickered to life above me, casting a long, warm glow across the yard as the evening deepened into quiet. Months passed, and the house settled into its own rhythm again. The garden bloomed earlier than usual that spring, filling the yard with the faint sweetness of camellias and damp earth. I spent most mornings at the long oak table in the study, sorting through papers for the foundation. I'd decided to create something that would make sense of everything that had happened. The Marston Foundation for Senior Rights opened quietly, without speeches or cameras. Charles helped with the legal work, and a small team of volunteers came together from the local university. We offered legal advice to older people caught in the same kind of betrayal I'd lived through. Every story that reached our office felt painfully familiar voices trembling over the phone, wondering how love could turn so cruel. Each time I listened, I remembered that the law wasn't just words on paper. It was proof that someone was willing to stand beside them. The inheritance had once felt heavy, almost shameful. Now it carried purpose. The same money Lydia had tried to claim became a shield for people who couldn't fight alone. That evening, I walked out onto the porch with a glass of sweet tea and watched the last light fade over Savannah. The cicadas hummed and the street lamps flickered on, one by one. I reached for the old switch beside the door and turned on the porch light Henry had installed 40 years ago, back when the house was new and our laughter still filled its walls. Warm light spilled across the steps, soft and steady, cutting through the shadows that had once claimed this place. I stood there for a while, listening to the night breathe around me. Home, I whispered, isn't what you inherit, it's what you defend.